The walls of Acre rise from the Mediterranean coast like a sleeping giant, 40 feet of stone that have withstood sieges for 1,000 years. It's June 1191, and the city is dying. Inside, 6,000 Muslim defenders are slowly starving, reduced to eating their horses, then their leather, then nothing. Outside, an army of crusaders has surrounded the city for nearly 2 years. And they're dying too. From disease, from starvation, from the grinding misery of a siege that has no end in sight. Then the ships arrive. A fleet bearing the Golden Lions of England cuts through the blue Mediterranean waters, their sails billowing like the promise of salvation. On the lead vessel stands a man whose reputation precedes him like thunder before a storm. Richard Plantagenet, the first of his name, King of England. They call him the Lionheart, though whether it's for his courage or his cruelty, no one quite agrees. He's 33 years old, tall and powerfully built, with reddish gold hair that catches the sunlight like a crown. He stands at the bow in full armor despite the heat, his eyes fixed on Acre's walls with the intensity of a predator studying prey. Behind him, his ships carry fresh troops, siege engines, and something more dangerous than any weapon: absolute certainty that he will win. The crusaders on the beach erupt in celebration as Richard's fleet anchors. They've been dying here for 2 years, watching their friends succumb to disease and arrows, slowly losing hope that Jerusalem could ever be reclaimed. But Richard is here now. Richard, who has never lost a battle, who crushed rebellions in France with such brutality that men surrendered at the mere mention of his approach, who took the cross not because God called him, but because war is the only thing that makes him feel alive. Saladin watches from his camp in the hills behind Acre. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the man who shattered the Crusader kingdoms and recaptured Jerusalem, knows what's coming. He's studied Richard's reputation, heard the stories of his tactical brilliance and his complete absence of mercy. The siege that has been a grinding stalemate for 2 years is about to become something else entirely. Neither man knows it yet, but their clash will produce one of the Crusade's most horrifying atrocities. An event so brutal it will shock even medieval chroniclers accustomed to violence. The pieces are moving into place. The siege is about to end, and what follows will stain both their legacies with blood that history can never wash away. If you think you know Richard the Lionheart from legends and stories, you've only seen the polished myth. Here, on Brutal History, we dig beneath the crown to find the man, the warrior king, whose brilliance was matched only by his capacity for calculated cruelty. Every view, every like, every subscription pulls another truth from the blood-soaked sands of Acre. To understand what Richard did at Acre, you need to see the man behind the legend, and the life that forged him into something harder than the steel he carried. Richard was born on September 8th, 1157, at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, the third son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He wasn't supposed to be king. His older brother Henry was the heir, groomed for the throne, while Richard was given the Duchy of Aquitaine, his mother's lands in southern France. Richard inherited Aquitaine at 11 years old and spent his teenage years learning to fight, not in tournaments, but in real campaigns where mistakes meant death. By 15, he was leading armies. By 16, he'd crushed his first rebellion with a brutality that made grown men fear a boy who should have still been in lessons. He burned castles with defenders inside, hanged rebels from their own walls, and developed a reputation for being utterly without mercy once crossed. Henry II was a brilliant administrator, but a terrible father who played his sons against each other like chess pieces. Richard rebelled against him twice, once alongside his mother Eleanor, who Henry imprisoned for 16 years as punishment. Richard learned early that family meant nothing when power was at stake, that trust was weakness, and that the only person you could rely on was yourself. When his older brother Henry died in 1183, Richard became heir to the English throne. But his father refused to officially recognize him, paranoid that Richard would do to him what Richard had already tried: take the crown by force. For 6 years, they circled each other like wolves, until Henry finally died in 1189, reportedly uttering Richard's name with his last breath, cursing the son who'd broken him. Richard took the throne at 31, and his first act as king revealed everything about his priorities. He immediately began raising money for a crusade. He sold government positions, castles, entire towns. He reportedly joked that he'd sell London itself if he could find a buyer. England was just a bank account to fund his real passion: war in the Holy Land. The Third Crusade had been called 2 years earlier, after Saladin's stunning victory at the Horns of Hattin in 1187, where he destroyed the largest Crusader army ever assembled and recaptured Jerusalem after 88 years of Christian rule. The loss had shocked all of Europe. Jerusalem, the holy city, the spiritual heart of Christianity, was in Muslim hands. Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade, and 3 of Europe's most powerful kings took the cross: Richard of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. Frederick drowned crossing a river in Turkey, his army disintegrating without him. Philip and Richard reached the Holy Land, but their alliance was poisoned from the start. Childhood friends turned bitter rivals who could barely stand being in the same camp. But everyone knew who the real commander was. Richard had the reputation, the tactical mind, and the absolute certainty that he would succeed where others had failed. When Richard arrived at Acre in June 1191, the siege had been grinding on for 22 months. It had started in August 1189, when Guy de Lusignan, the disgraced king of Jerusalem who'd lost his entire kingdom at Hattin, decided to reclaim his crown by taking back Acre. He had maybe 7,000 men against a city garrisoned by 6,000 Muslim defenders. It should have been a quick siege. Then Saladin arrived with his entire army and surrounded the Crusaders. The siege became a bizarre stalemate. Crusaders besieging a city while being besieged themselves by Saladin's forces. For nearly 2 years, both sides slowly starved. Disease killed more than combat. The Crusaders ate their horses, then grass, then anything they could find. Inside Acre, the garrison was no better off, cut off from supplies by the Crusader blockade. Richard transformed everything within weeks. He brought fresh troops, massive siege engines, and the kind of manic energy that infected his entire army. He was everywhere, supervising the construction of trebuchets, personally joining mining operations to dig under Acre's walls, offering gold bounties for every stone knocked from the battlements. When he fell sick with a fever that left him bedridden, he had himself carried to the siege lines on a stretcher so he could direct operations while barely conscious. His engineers built massive siege towers and stone-throwing machines that battered Acre's walls day and night. The defenders fought desperately, pouring boiling oil and dropping stones on attackers, but Richard's assault was relentless. By early July, sections of Acre's walls had been reduced to rubble. The defenders, starving and without hope of relief, sent envoys to negotiate surrender. The terms were specific and carefully detailed. Acre's garrison of 2,700 soldiers would surrender and be taken prisoner. Saladin would pay 200,000 gold dinars as ransom within 1 month. He would return 1,600 Christian prisoners held since the Battle of Hattin. And he would return the true cross, the relic supposedly from Christ's crucifixion, captured at Hattin, and the most sacred object in Christendom. On July 12, 1191, Acre's gates opened. The Muslim garrison marched out and laid down their weapons. The Crusaders poured into the city they'd besieged for nearly 2 years, planting their banners on walls that had seemed impregnable. Richard installed himself in the former governor's palace, the finest building in Acre, and sent messengers to Saladin in the hills. Fulfill the terms by August 20th, or the prisoners die. It wasn't a bluff. It wasn't a negotiating tactic. Richard Plantagenet didn't make idle threats. But Saladin, the brilliant strategist who'd rebuilt the Muslim world, the commander who'd crushed the Crusaders at Hattin, made a fatal miscalculation. He thought Richard was bound by the same codes of medieval warfare that governed other Christian kings, codes that said noble prisoners were ransomed, that wholesale massacre was forbidden, that some rules held even in holy war. Saladin had never faced anyone like Richard before, and he was about to learn exactly what the Lionheart was willing to do when someone tested his patience. Saladin began his response to Richard's demands with partial compliance. He sent an initial payment, a fraction of the 200,000 dinars demanded. He released some Christian prisoners, but nowhere near the 1,600 specified. As for the true cross, he claimed it needed to be located, that it would take time, that he was working on it. Each message bought him days, then weeks. It was classic Saladin: strategic delay, diplomatic maneuvering, buying time to regroup his forces and plan his next move. Richard saw through it immediately. He'd spent his life dealing with nobles who promised and delayed, who signed treaties they never intended to honor. He understood Saladin's strategy: stall until Richard marched south toward Jerusalem, then rescue the prisoners from Acre and reoccupy the city. The 2,700 Muslim soldiers currently held prisoner would become Saladin's garrison again, and Richard would have won nothing. But Richard had his own strategic problem. He couldn't leave Acre with enemy soldiers alive in his rear. They'd be freed and rearmed the moment he left. He couldn't take them with him on a mobile campaign toward Jerusalem. Feeding, guarding, and moving thousands of prisoners through hostile territory was logistically impossible. and he couldn't afford to leave a significant portion of his army behind to guard them while Saladin's forces roamed free in the countryside. Philip Augustus of France saw the problem and wanted no part of the solution. The French king, sick with dysentery and reportedly terrified of what Richard was contemplating, announced he was returning to France. He took his troops, but left the moral weight of the decision entirely on Richard's shoulders. The other Crusader leaders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the German Knights, all looked to Richard for orders. They had prisoners they couldn't keep, couldn't release, and couldn't afford. Richard gave Saladin a final deadline, August 20th. Pay the full ransom, return all the prisoners, deliver the true cross, or consequences would follow. He didn't specify what those consequences would be, but the message was clear enough. Saladin sent another partial payment and more promises. He was calling what he thought was a bluff. On August 20th, the deadline passed. Saladin's latest message arrived with excuses and requests for more time. Richard read it, crumpled it, and gave orders that would echo through history. Bring every Muslim prisoner to the plain outside Acre's walls. All of them, in full view of Saladin's army positioned in the hills. The 2,700 prisoners were marched out in groups throughout the morning. Soldiers who'd surrendered with promises of ransom, who'd believed the terms of surrender would be honored. Their hands were bound behind their backs with rope. They were made to kneel in rows that stretched across the field like crops ready for harvest. From the hills above, Saladin's entire army watched, understanding slowly dawning as the formations took shape. Richard positioned his forces between the execution ground and Saladin's army. Archers, infantry, cavalry in full armor. The message was brutally clear. Any attempt at rescue would be met with total war. Saladin's commanders begged him to attack, to do something, but the Sultan held his ground. Charging across open terrain into prepared Crusader positions would mean annihilating his army for men who were likely already dead. It was the same cold calculation Richard had made, just from the other side. Then, Richard gave the order, and the systematic killing began. It took hours. Crusader soldiers moved down the lines with swords, axes, whatever weapons they carried. Some executions were quick, clean beheadings that ended in seconds. Others were butchery, multiple strikes required as exhausted executioners hacked at necks and bodies. The prisoners prayed, screamed, fought uselessly against their bonds, or simply waited in silence for their turn. The sand turned dark with blood that kept flowing, pooling, soaking into the earth until the ground itself seemed to bleed. Richard watched from horseback, his face revealing nothing. Contemporary chronicles describe him as unmoved, neither enjoying the slaughter nor flinching from it. This was war stripped of its romantic veneer, not knights in glorious combat, but cold logistics written in human lives. He'd given Saladin a choice, and Saladin had chosen to test him. Now 2,700 men paid the price for that miscalculation. From the hills, Saladin's army stood paralyzed. Muslim chroniclers later wrote of soldiers weeping openly, of commanders tearing their clothes in anguish, of the Sultan himself watching in silence as his men died while he could do nothing. It was his worst moment, not a battlefield defeat, but a complete failure to protect those who'd surrendered under terms he'd agreed to negotiate. When the killing finally ended at sunset, the field was carpeted with bodies. Richard ordered them left where they fell, a message written in corpses visible from Saladin's camp. Let the Sultan see the cost of breaking faith with Richard Plantagenet. Saladin's response came within days. Every Christian prisoner in his custody, the ones he'd been slowly gathering for ransom, was executed. The numbers roughly matched. The cycle of atrocity was complete, both sides proving they could match cruelty for cruelty, that the rules of war meant nothing when kingdoms and religions collided. But the massacre achieved Richard's strategic goal. Saladin understood now that negotiations required compliance, that the English king valued results over reputation, that he would commit any atrocity to achieve his objectives. For the remainder of the Third Crusade, Saladin avoided pitched battles, used guerrilla tactics, and eventually agreed to a 3-year truce that gave Christians access to Jerusalem without requiring them to conquer it. Richard left the Holy Land in October 1192, having spent barely 16 months in the crusade he'd spent years preparing for. He never set foot in Jerusalem, though he came within view of it. The Acre massacre remained his legacy. Christian chroniclers justified it as military necessity. Muslim sources recorded it as proof of Crusader barbarism. Both were right. This isn't about heroes or villains. Both Richard and Saladin committed acts that would be war crimes today. This is about what happens when war becomes total, when mercy becomes tactical weakness, when human lives are calculated as resources in a grand strategy. Richard the Lionheart earned his legend not just through battlefield courage, but through a willingness to do what others couldn't stomach. Here on Brutal History, we don't crown kings without counting their victims. We remember the 2,700 Muslims who knelt in the August sun at Acre and never rose. We remember the 1,600 Christians executed in response by Saladin's forces. The field is rebuilt now, the blood long washed away by centuries of rain. But the truth remains, and it's ours to carry.